Backseas Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless!
Hey, everybody, it's Bax, and thanks for tuning in to Baxi's Musical Podcast. So my guest today, Marc Wasserman, the author of the book Ska Boom. Now, one of the things you're going to hear today is how fans of ska, reggae, and two-tone all arrived at this incredible music and how it sunk its teeth into our souls and how we never let it go and how we allowed it to happen. Marc's got his story. I have mine. And mine starts off something like this. It's 1984, and while most of the essential UK ska bands like the Specials and Madness and the Selector were essentially finishing up their early run and moving on to different things in 1979, 1981, I decided to go on a road trip with a fistful of cassettes and a cheap battery-powered boombox. And as it turns out, I only needed one of those tapes. Side one, you had Just Can't Stop It by the English Beat. And on the other side, their third album, Special Beat Service. For 6 straight hours, I did nothing but listen to those albums over and over again. And that was my first real, true introduction to two-tone ska. And when I got to where I was going, I stopped by a Strawberries record shop and bought the first album by the Specials. Now I had 3 cassettes for the ride home, and by the end of the trip, I was totally hooked. I got rid of the tapes, replaced them with vinyl. I bought the Specials, the Beat, the Madness, the Selector, the Bad Manners. I bought the Dance Craze soundtrack, a few other compilations too. I was, in fact, officially hooked. And while I finished buying all of the available two-tone ska that I could get my hands on, I started to listen to other bands like Fishbone, the Toasters, Bim Scala Bim, and the Untouchables. And as it turns out, the American stuff from the mid-'80s was actually pretty damn good too. And as it turns out, ska bands were popping up all over the place, especially in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And by the 1990s, ska would resurface once again, reaching their commercial peak with bands like Operation Ivy, which would later become Rancid, Sublime, Real Big Fish, No Doubt, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. Suddenly, ska was becoming a commercially viable entity in the United States, more than a decade after two-tone was ripping through charts in the UK. My guest today, Marc Wasserman, is one of the country's foremost experts in ska. Having not only formed the first ska band in New Jersey in the 1980s, he's also written a new book entitled Ska Boom, an American ska and reggae oral history. Marc has not only compiled interviews with hundreds of musicians, he's also the host of the Ska Boom podcast, which is excellent. And today we're going to talk about all that stuff with my guest today, author Marc Wasserman, on Baxi's Musical Podcast. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
I was this close to wearing a pork pie hat and some braces, and my Doc Martens just hurt my feet, so I said, nah, to hell with it. Maybe not today.
Be comfortable.
Yeah, I want to be comfortable, exactly. About halfway through Ska Boom.
I appreciate that because I realize it's a very, very long book.
It's a long book, but it's really cool because I think anyone who enjoys ska on any level, whether it's two-tone or the American stuff, you know, everyone seems to come about discovering ska in their own way. And I think that's a real cool thing about that genre. It certainly did to me. And, you know, once it sinks its meat hooks into you, it's the kind of genre that never really leaves you, never lets go.
100% agree. I've been listening to it since I was 14 years old, and I'm 57 now. So there you go.
Years ago, I was home from college, and I made this road trip to go visit a friend. And I had borrowed like a fistful of cassettes from another friend of mine. And all I had was like an AM radio and a cassette player in the car. And I had this real cheap, shitty boombox. And I wound up playing this. Out of the 6 cassettes I brought, I wound up playing one cassette for the entire trip. And on one side, it was the English Beat, Just Can't Stop It. On the other side, it was Special Beat Service. And I just let it continue to run over and over and over again. And it wasn't like I was unfamiliar with the music, but it was like at that moment, it was like, okay, this is really something very special.
Wow. Well, I have to laugh because I had that same boombox. I guess, you know, I had an old beater of a car and it only had an AM radio. So the only way I was going to be able to listen to my music was I had the little boombox next to me on the seat. So I know that well.
So tell me how it landed for you. I mean, you talk about it in the introduction of your book, but how did ska present itself to you?
Well, I grew up from a very young age. I've always loved music. My parents played a lot of music in the house. They had albums. I played those albums. Carole King, the Beatles, Fifth Dimension, things like that. But when we lived in Massachusetts at one point. My dad got moved around a lot for his job. There was in Medfield, Mass. There was a five and dime, and in that five and dime, there was a little section of the store that had 45 singles. I mean, you have to be a certain age, I think, to remember this. But my mom would take me and my sister there once a week, and they were $1 for a 45, and she'd give me $1, and I was allowed to pick out 145 every week, and I built up quite a collection. But that started me into like appreciating records and music and storytelling and songs. So that's where my passion for music started, and then sort of discovered the radio and listening to AM radio mostly. I lived mostly in New Jersey, so WABC was huge down here. So it was top 40 radio. But I had a friend right before freshman year of high school, so that was 1979 for me, who invited me over one day. He said, "I got to play you this record," and it was the Specials' first record. And I describe it as a lightning bolt moment. He put that record on, and I had literally never heard anything like that before. And it lit up all the neurons in my brain. And that was sort of my gateway into two-tone, but also into ska and reggae music. But that was the first time I'd ever heard anything. And I remember being a little bit afraid because it was so unlike anything I'd ever heard. Couldn't really understand what they were singing about. The guitars were a little bit louder than the music I was listening to on AM radio and disco that was popular at the time. But there was just something about it that grabbed me.
Yeah.
So that was really how it all started.
It did the same thing for me too. Obviously it starts with the English beat for me, but then, I had a friend say, well, then you need to listen to the Specials. And as soon as there was that, well, you should listen to the Selector too. And, everybody, when I was in high school, we knew Madness, but we knew Madness almost like a pop band. Like, Our House was a pop song, didn't feel like they were a ska band anymore. I mean, a good bulk of what they were doing certainly was, but much like you, as I'm going to record stores once a week, I'm finding myself looking for two-tone compilations and anything I can get my hands on, because there was such a limited amount of those bands to begin with, and then these compilations came out. Dance Craze was one of the first ones that I got, and at that point, it became a little bit easier, and you almost wished that there was more of it, which would come later on, and how it wound up sinking into American music. But nevertheless, that those early days of me buying those records were really exciting. I got real fixated on that stuff right away.
You and I sound very similar in that regard. You had to sort of be a musical detective. And I have to pay respects to certain clerks at record stores. They didn't suffer fools very well, but if you actually would say to somebody like you did, "Hey, I really like this record by the Specials. Is there anything else like this that you could recommend?" A couple guys pointed me in the right direction. That's how I discovered the English beat. That's how I discovered the Selector. And then you sort of took it from there. You just as you said, you just scoured record stores. There's Black and White Check on this. Is that a ska record? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. So, that was part of the fun of like, sometimes you'd hit on something and sometimes you'd hit a dog. But, it was all part of that experience of enriching and enlarging your musical palette.
I had a chance to talk to Horace Panther and Dave Wakeling about ska, and their perspective is very, very similar. Because you ask about the two-tone movement, and it starts with Jerry Dammers of the Specials, and what's really fascinating is at that time in England, you didn't see a lot of integration in between bands. You didn't see anybody that looked like Pauline Black and the Selector. You absolutely didn't see anybody look like Bad Manners, and that's probably for good reason. But the music was rooted in interesting level of diversity, both racial and sexual, and I think the importance of that was pretty profound.
100%. I like to say it was a little bit like the early days of hip hop here in America. That's what two-tone was like for England. It was people living on the front lines in inner cities like Birmingham and London, and taking those experiences and putting them to music that really connected with working class kids all over England. And that, then that sort of traveled over here. Some of that got lost in translation because obviously the American experience and the British experience are different. But what you find happening, and really what's documented in my book, is there are a lot of people like you and me who had that experience of really being turned on to two-tone and then saying, well, I want to start a band that sounds like this. And so, I talk about, I think literally every person I interviewed in my book, and I interviewed a lot of people, they all mentioned the Specials and the English Beat. So those two bands sort of hover over every single American band that started in the late 70s and early 80s. They were all influenced by hearing those records and the messages in those records, and then taking that and trying to create an American version of that around what they pulled from those records.
You also talk in the book about starting your own ska band, many years ago, and actually starting the first ska band in New Jersey, which I think is very, very cool. But as I was reading this, I'm thinking, well, how did you find other like-minded people to play with? Because ska, unless you've heard it, it's a very challenging type of rhythm to get down. In the ways you play, bass or organ or whatever, it's very different. How did you find people to play with you? I don't know, was Bigger Thomas the first ska band?
Yeah, that's right. Bigger Thomas. We were called Panic originally. We had to change our name because there was a heavy metal band from Seattle with that name. But it's interesting, in pre-internet days, there were different ways that you connected with people. When we started Bigger Thomas, it was me and the guitar player. We had spent a lot of time woodshedding in his tiny little apartment in New Brunswick, New Jersey, writing these songs. We didn't have a band. We didn't have a singer or anything like that. So I made flyers, and I lived in New Brunswick, which is where Rutgers University is, the State University of New Jersey. And I just put these flyers up on campus buses, bus stops, all over the campus. And it was through hook or by crook that we ended up with this very motley crew of 7 people. Some of us were students, some of the guys were townies, and we had different levels of musicianship, but we all had a passion for ska and reggae. It was kind of amazing that everybody kind of knew what it was and how to play it. And that's how we started. We started banging songs out in the basement of the house I lived in New Brunswick.
One of the things that I asked both Horace and Dave Wakeling was, because this is something that I think is really interesting and shows this almost. It's not a hypocritical thing by any means, but just shows the diversity of the audience who were listening to ska, especially in England. At the time it first came out, it was a genre of music that tended to appeal to skinheads. And yet you had this diversity which wound up chipping away at that. It's hard to imagine those bands without Ranking Roger or, Linval Golding or, Everett Morton. The fact of the matter is, when 1979, 1980, it was pretty shocking to see that kind of diversity and to play in front of people that have literally no tolerance for that.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I think in cities like London and Coventry and Birmingham, it was very common for Black and white people to live next door to one another. So it wasn't such a big deal when you would see mixed bands in England. Now, when those bands came over here, they were struck by how Americans found it very strange that there were interracial bands. That was not part of our experience here. You had rock bands and you had Motown, and everybody sort of stayed in their own lane. So again, one of the things that came through in my book when I interviewed all these folks was that two-tone sort of became an organizing philosophy for a lot of kids. It was for me, that we were like, well, if these guys can do it, why can't we do it? Like, why can't we address some of the issues with racial segregation and racism here in America? And what better way to do that than to have mixed bands where we're sort of showing audiences, hey, it's really not that hard to do this. And actually, when you bring together different people's experiences and their musical interests, you can actually create something really fresh and new.
It's interesting that when you go through each band in the book, everyone from the Box Boys to Hooters to the Blue Rhythm Band and the others that get talked about, is American record companies simply did not know what the hell to do with these bands. I mean, obviously you're talking about bands with great potential. They had really good songs. Some of these bands were very true to the music, but as soon as these record companies tried to figure out how to market them properly, all of a sudden there seemed to be this intervention of their ideas that wind up taking a lot of bands kind of way off track. I mean, like you mentioned, like the band, and I really didn't even think of them as a ska band, but the Hooters were one of the bands that you talk about in the book. And I guess when I think about All You Zombies, I don't think of that as a ska song, but in the book, I'm saying, okay, all right, maybe. But that was a band that seemed to have some sort of, I don't know, overbearing process above them, kind of steering them in a more pop direction than what I think they really wanted to be. And that sounds like a recurring theme over and over again.
Yeah, very much so. There's another chapter in the book about a band called the Shakers, who were probably the very first American reggae band. They built a huge following in Berkeley, California. They sold out this club every Sunday night for a year, and there was a bidding war to sign them. They were signed to by David Geffen, believe it or not, to Elektra Asylum. And then the record label had no idea what to do to them. They sort of tried to change them into like a vacation-y Beach Boys. But that was not what these guys wanted to do. These guys were a reggae band. So yes, you're right. That happened again with the Hooters, who built a whole humongous following around where I live in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, playing ska music, believe it or not, and became huge and were signed to CBS. And CBS basically said, listen, we need to bring you to the center here a little bit because we're going to get you on the radio. So All You Zombies, if you listen to the original version of All You Zombies, it's a straight up reggae song.
Yeah.
But the version that was put on that CBS record was more rock than reggae. And, that's sort of what the compromise was in order to be signed to a major label.
One of the chapters, I was so happy to read this one that you were including them in this book, was the Untouchables. That's a band I remember, playing in college radio. And, is right about the same time that Fishbone was coming out in 1985, 86, somewhere around there. And I just remember the songs by the Untouchables and thinking, my God, this is such a great record. And it was always one of these things where, well, what happened to them? I know they had other records, but it felt very much like it was a one and done thing with them. Tell me about the Untouchables.
Yeah, well, the Untouchables story was probably the one that I enjoyed writing the most and felt the most passionate about because in my mind, they're the first American ska band. If you ask the guys in the band, they would actually call themselves mods. They mixed sort of like the Who with Northern Soul and Motown and threw some two-tone in it. But they're, in my opinion, a straight up first American ska band. And they created a huge buzz in LA. They're responsible essentially for making California sort of the epicenter of American ska. They built a scene around this little club called the On Club in LA, and they just sold out everywhere they went, sort of like the Hooters in Philadelphia, but on a much larger scale in Southern California. And they couldn't get signed to save their lives by an American label. It was a British label, Stiff Records, that actually signed them, and then took them over to England and tried to turn them into a replacement for Madness. You mentioned Madness earlier. They had just lost Madness. Madness had jumped from Stiff to a larger, bigger label. So Dave Robinson, the president of Stiff, thought the Untouchables would be his replacement for Madness. It didn't work out that well for them, but they were very popular in Europe, and they played sold out shows all over Europe, in England, Germany, France, Italy. But when they came back to America, nobody, again, this dichotomy between how Europeans and Brits look at this type of music and Americans do. When they came back to the US, they were on MCA at that point. The execs at MCA had no idea what to do with them, and they just sort of disappeared, sadly. Because I think they had a lot more to say and more good music to make.
And they were great musicians, too. I mean, I never got a chance to see them live, but I remember the videos and thinking, okay, they remind me very much of what Fishbone was. Fishbone, to this day, I think is maybe the greatest live band I've ever seen. And I've probably seen them a dozen times. And, ska fits into their early development. They would become very different as years would go by. And I know Norwood Fisher was interviewed a couple of times, and especially in light of the Untouchables. But those kinds of bands, when they were performing live, I mean, the crowds were going crazy over those bands.
Right. And in California, they could do no wrong, the Untouchables. And Fishbone, who were totally influenced by the Untouchables, were like teenagers who would go and see the Untouchables play and were inspired by them to start Fishbone. And there's a lot of love between the guys in both those bands because of the connection they had, where Fishbone got to open shows for the Untouchables. But sadly, both those bands, I'm a huge fan of Fishbone too. I still don't think they've gotten the credit they're due for their musicianship and how diverse they are in the type of songs that they write.
Somebody, like I said, I've seen them a bunch of times, and every time I've seen them, there's always been some sort of story. And the one that I will never ever forget, They were playing in an amphitheater in Milwaukee. I was going to school out there, and they opened in this amphitheater for the Violent Femmes. Now, to me, that is like I can't imagine a band saying, "Hey, you know what? We should get the Fishbone to open for us, and then we should see how we do after them." Because like they just completely mop the floor, and then then all of a sudden the Violent Femmes are on the stage and they're thinking around on their instruments. It was just like the most bizarre. You can't follow a band like that. You just can't.
No, it's funny you say that. There's a band in my book called the Uptones, who
Yep.
were the first ska bands from Northern California, from San Francisco. And they related a similar story to me where they played a couple shows with Fishbone and they learned the hard way that you never let Fishbone open for you. Never. Because there's just no way to compete.
No, absolutely not. One of the bands that I was a fan of for a period of time was the Toasters. That's another band that you talked about. Tell me a little bit about them, because their story is kind of interesting, because to me they're like the Toasters and Bim Scala Bim. They seem to open the door for what would come up later in the 90s. But the Toasters are a pretty interesting example.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Some of those bands we've been talking about were in the late 70s and early 80s before ska started to get traction. It was the Toasters and Bim Scala Bim who kicked the door open. Really, they were pioneers. The Toasters were the first American band to tour across the U.S. They put their first album out independently, and it did very well. And Rob Hingley, who still performs, he's now in his mid-60s. He just was on tour a couple weeks ago. He was a Brit who came over to help run a comic book store in New York. He loved ska and reggae, and he tried to start a band. And the first couple times, he just couldn't find Americans who could play ska. You mentioned earlier, it's a strange beat if you're not familiar with it. The drums in particular, the bass line's different. But he taught some of these people how to play, and then he just built kind of the New York City ska scene that I came up.
Yeah,
he was sort of like the godfather, and he would let younger bands open for the Toasters and just open doors for so many people. So he deserves, and the Toasters deserve a lot of credit. Like the Untouchables and Fishbone, was sort of being innovators and really passionate pioneers. I'd throw Bim Scala Bim on that as well. Bands and members of those bands who are willing to get in a van and for 3 months drive from the East Coast to the West Coast and back and play a show literally every day, wherever they could.
yeah.
And it was because of that work that they did that they opened the doors for many, many bands that followed.
You'd mentioned the Untouchables thinking of themselves as mods, and it's interesting that came up in the book, because there's a couple of things that seem to be kind of like touchstones with ska, not just in England but certainly here in America. Quadrophenia would be one of them, a movie literally about mods. But then also the movie Dance Craze, inspired a lot of people here and elsewhere. The Harder They Come soundtrack also, you had Jimmy Cliff and Toots and the Maytals and these kinds of touchstones seem to be among the things that inspired all these guys. Not just the music, but the look of ska is a pretty interesting part of the whole connection, the whole scene.
Very, very important part, because again, pre-internet, where did you get information? How did you learn things? You couldn't just type on your computer mods. So Quadrophenia was huge. Not only is it a great story, but the looks, the fashion, the way the guys dressed was huge. And then you use that as a guide, a blueprint. Then you got to go find that stuff. And in the late 70s and early 80s, it wasn't easy to find a pork pie hat or a black suit, or Doc Marten boots or any of that stuff. So again, you just spent hours in thrift stores or Salvation Army stores just looking for like 60s suits or 60s looks. So that was a huge part of it. But also you mentioned Dance Craze and The Harder They Come. That was really about, for many of us, particularly American kids, those bands didn't have MTV videos. So the only way you were going to see them was if you were lucky enough to see that movie in the movie theater, and it was only there for like a week. So I remember my friends and I used to pass around a bootleg copy of a VHS copy of dance craze, and so that's how. And it was like three generations, so it wasn't the greatest quality, but that stuff was so important to us because it gave us a bit of a guide when otherwise we were sort of lost in the wilderness.
So I was a fan of the specials like you were, but I think when I heard that soundtrack of the specials on Dance Craze, that's when I really started to pay real close attention to, because to me the versions of Gangsters, it just was like, it just seems so much more powerful. And even when I talked to Horace Panther about it, he said, I wish more people could have seen us live in our heyday, because I mean, there are plenty of people who will hear, Elvis Costello's production of that first record and say, man, he could have done so much more. But yet that's the sound that they really wanted on that record, which I thought was really interesting, because a lot of people tend to have a problem with the Elvis Costello production.
Yeah, I think I understand that criticism, and yet you're right. It's hard to take a band who are explosive on stage and put them in a studio and capture that explosiveness. Sometimes the studio can confine you, and depending upon who your producer is, that has a lot of an effect on what that ultimate final produced sound is. I still think that Elvis Costello produced album is great, but I 100% agree with you that hearing them on Dance Craze is like a revelation. It is just like somebody lit them and they explode.
Mm-hmm.
Like the power and the energy of the versions of those songs, it really doesn't compare to the album versions, but I appreciate them both.
We talked earlier about record label intervention and changing sounds. Many of these bands, wind up changing their sounds in the 80s. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like with the specials like Fun Boy 3 or General Public and Madness, they became more pop centered rather than ska centered as they kind of transformed into other things. You'll find Young Cannibals, for example. And I wonder if the answer to this, whether that was because of the same kind of record label intervention, or did they feel like they were confined by ska and needed to branch out into new territory?
That's a really interesting question. I've started to work on my next book. I've submitted a proposal for the 33 and a third series. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's these. Each book is about an album. So if I'm lucky enough to be selected, I'm going to be writing a book about Special Beat Service, which is a huge album of mine I love very much. So I have been really researching that album a lot, reading a lot of archival interviews with all the members of the English Beat, Dave Wakeling, Rankin Roger, Andy Cox and David Steele. It's interesting. The English Beat had three very distinct albums and three very distinct sounds. They couldn't be confined. They were very into whatever their latest interests were musically, whatever their latest influences were. And I think that's the beauty behind them. But also, their star in England started to wane a little bit after their second album will happen. And they were signed here in the US to IRS Records, who are very traditional, a upstart American label. And American audiences were looking, I think, for something a little bit different. And I think the band at that point were experimenting. And, if you listen to, you're a fan of Special Beat Service, there's a lot going on that record. It's almost like a kitchen sink of everybody's influences. There's reggae, there's ska, there's Motown, there's soul, there's Latin music on there. And unfortunately, they broke up before I think they could have taken that album a little bit further. It was really starting to make inroads here. There were videos on MTV. They played two of the US festivals, which is a big Gen X thing. If you're a Gen Xer, you know what the US festival is. They were the only band to be invited to play there twice. They were on American Bandstand. So all these things were happening to make the English Beat stars. And they decided to pull the plug before I think they could see that through to fruition. But the evidence is that the Fine Young Cannibals sort of ended up having the success that I think the English Beat could have had if they had stayed together. Yeah.
It's at the time, I know a lot of people kind of questioned the second record by English Beat, What Happened? But I think that album is actually aged better than the other two. I find myself reaching for that one a little bit more in the last 5 or 6 years, because there's to me there's some gems on that record that really never got the attention that the other two did. I all three records are great, but that one's starting to really grow on me in a real profound way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a maturity about that record that maybe when we were teenagers or in our 20s, we couldn't appreciate some of the themes that are raised in it. There's some dark stuff on that record, but it's presented in such a joyful way. The sounds are fantastic. And Special Beat Service, the same for me. It came along at a time where I was, getting ready to graduate from high school and figuring out what it meant to be an adult. And there were a lot of themes on that record. So, I don't think the English Beat ever played by the rules of here's what a ska band is supposed to sound like or look like. And that's one of the things that so many of us really loved about them. They had Ranking Roger was 17 years old when he joined the Beat, and Saxa was in his 50s.
Yeah.
So you had such a crazy mixed diversity and I think that's always been reflected in their sounds.
So in the 90s, there's another wave of ska that comes. I mean, you had Operation Ivy, which eventually becomes, Rancid and Sublime and Real Big Fish, and, No Doubt for that matter. Obviously, this is when ska starts to reach a commercial peak here in the United States. And suddenly record companies seem to start to understand where this music falls, or, they finally seem to understand how to market these artists correctly. Do you think that was what made that third wave work?
Yeah, I think there were a couple things going on. First of all, again, going back to the Toasters and Bim Scala Bim, two bands who opened the doors and did a lot of the legwork that benefited the bands you just mentioned. So without the Toasters and Bim Scala Bim touring and bringing these bands along with them to open, those bands aren't going to have a chance. I think the other thing that happened was that record labels started to hire people who were fans of ska. And they knew what it was, and they knew that it was marketable because they'd been at shows that were considered underground where there were like 3,000 kids dancing to the Untouchables, or 500 kids in North Dakota dancing to the Toasters, and we're like, there's something going on here. Selling out shows in Chicago, LA, and New York, and not getting any coverage, but that there's a grassroots thing going. And I think that had a lot to do. All those things combined had a lot to do. And you had MTV. Gwen Stefani, attractive woman, great voice, videos that connected with a very broad audience. So certain people, smart people at record labels, started to put it together. How can we market this music and make it popular? And so it had, yeah, you're right. This third wave of ska, it's called, from like 95 to about 97 was really had its peak.
I had an old producer of mine was a huge ska fan, like bigger than maybe anyone I've ever known. But while that wave was going on, he was introducing me to like to Let's Go Bowling or Mephistopheles and bands like that, and it was nice to see that genre wasn't necessarily just going for a big payday. There were some that were going to be true to ska, and that was kind of fun to know that it's still out there, and that the torch for ska is still burning pretty damn brightly.
Yeah, it's funny. Both those bands you mentioned are in my book, and they both took different approaches, but did it their own way. So Let's Go Bowling never had a lead singer, mostly instrumental, worshiped the Scotalites, and that was their deal. Mephistopheles, we're going to be the first Satan worshiping ska band. Just such a clever way to market themselves, and created like metal ska, I guess.
Yeah.
But both bands, true to both love ska, but did it in different ways. And to me, that's sort of the ingenuity of American ska, was that musicians here took what two-tone and 60s and 70s reggae gave them and did something new by incorporating all these different sounds, punk, hardcore, metal, and created something fresh and new.
I think it's one of the reasons why, I listen occasionally to the Operation Ivy records, and there wasn't a lot produced, but it was like one of those bands that you hear it, and that was a hell of a band. They would obviously become Rancid and get fairly popular and have a great career, but that was like a record that was exactly what you're talking about, an amalgamation of of metal and ska that at that point I don't think really had been done before, at least not to that level of success.
Right. Operation Ivy and I'd say Mighty Mighty Boss Tones,
Yeah.
both in similar ways, but in different places, sort of took punk and hardcore and metal and sort of mixed it with ska. And then the great thing about both those bands who got huge was that in the case of Operation Ivy, they were huge fans of the Uptones. They were a couple years younger than the guys in the Uptones and were at every Uptones show. So they worshiped the Uptones and that was an influence on them. And the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones were huge fans of Bim Scala Bim and worshipped Bim Scala Bim. So that was what I enjoyed most about this book, was making sure that people understood that it didn't start with Rancid and the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. It started with these other bands, and these people who you think are the greatest American ska musicians actually were influenced by all these other bands you might not have heard of before.
You wound up interviewing a hell of a lot of people for this book, and a diverse amount of people, like people who you wouldn't necessarily have attached to other bands. Were people pretty easily convinced to participate? I mean, or did you have to fight real hard to get a few on there?
No, I would say 99% of the people that I approached were happy to speak with me. Everybody likes to talk about themselves, so that's one of the things I had going for me. But I also approached this with my own passion and told them stories about why their bands meant something to me. And listen, you don't go into ska music to make money. You go into it because you love it.
Right.
And if you have other people telling you that they love what you've done, that makes you feel like it was all worth it. So those, that helped a lot. But yeah, it was a lot of detective work because in some cases, some of these bands had broken up and they were not on the best of terms with one another. So I would have to sort of use my diplomatic skills to say, hey, I know you don't talk to Mr. X anymore, but have you got an email address for him or a cell phone number for him in your phone? And a lot of times they'd say, yeah, here you go. So I was able to piece together all the important players for each band, but it took me 3.5 years to
really
do all that. Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazingly long book. There's so much information, and that's great. I think that's what's great about it. It's not just like a little blurb here, a little blurb there. You're getting real deep into these bands, and it's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I did it in the oral history format because I didn't want it to be filtered through my perspective. It's not my story. I tell my own story in the beginning of the book, but this is all these bands' stories.
Yeah.
So it was important for me that it's not me commenting, it's them telling their stories. And if you haven't read an oral history before, it gives you a you are there sort of feeling because you're hearing it in real time, even though in some cases it's 30 or 40 years later that they're telling you these stories. But what was fun, it was like being a film editor, was I had to take all these different interviews and weave them together, hopefully in a narrative that would make it entertaining for you, the reader, to follow along.
You've also got the Ska Boom podcast. I've had a chance to listen to a couple of episodes, and it again, like everything else, it's really interesting. Different takes on ska, and also how people arrive at it. Like when we talked in the beginning here, that everyone has an arrival point at ska. I just think it's so cool to hear those kinds of stories from even just normal everyday people who are experiencing something that I've experienced, that you've experienced, getting to know this kinds of music.
Yeah, I love origin stories of any kind, whether it's sports teams or comic book heroes, superheroes, bands. I just love to hear why. What was it that made you decide this was the music that you were going to play? Why this instrument? Why those albums? Because everybody's got you told me your story, my story. I just love to hear those because there's a lot of commonality. You and I don't know each other, but we had very similar musical experiences. And I just think it brings people closer together when you hear that kind of stuff.
It's like you're speaking a language that not everybody speaks. You can relate to what I told you. I totally relate to what you're saying. And when I was listening to some of the podcast episodes, I was listening to the one you did about the beat girl. The beat girl.
Yeah.
I was listening to that and thinking, you know what? He's right. The beat girl was kind of hot.
I mean, say what you will. I had the T-shirt with her on it, and I was attracted to her, to a cartoon, and I felt like if I could find a girl that looks like her, I'll be very happy. But yeah, the Beat Girl story is a great one. If you are a fan of the English Beat, you know who the Beat Girl is, but nobody knew who she really was. And so that's the most recent episode of the podcast. I interviewed a woman who has done a documentary about who the Beat Girl really is, and her story is pretty interesting, and you learn some things about her that you might not expect to know.
Well, Mark, it's like I said, I really enjoyed the book. I can't wait to read the second half of it. It's taken me a while to read the first half, but it's really, really awesome. And if anyone is a fan of ska music, this is absolutely an essential read.
Thanks. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, and I appreciate you taking hours out of your life to read my book.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. Mark, thank you very much, and best of luck.
Thanks very much.
The name of Marc Wasserman's book is Ska Boom, an American ska and reggae oral history. Also, check out the Ska Boom podcast. And thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to rate it, subscribe it, share it with all your friends. You can email me at backs@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. And thanks again for listening to Backseat's Musical Podcast.